Carson's father watched The Tonight Show exactly once in 14 years. That night, his son said something about him that Carson had never said to anyone, not to his father directly, not to his wife, not to his closest friends. 14 million strangers heard it before the man it was about did. What happened the next morning? A phone call, 3 minutes, two men who didn't talk easily, left Carson unable to work for the rest of the day. It was March 11th, 1974. Homer Lloyd Carson was 71 years old and had lived in Scottsdale, Arizona since retiring from his career as a manager for a Midwestern power company. He was a quiet man, not cold, not distant, but contained in the way that men of his generation and background were contained, having grown up in rural Nebraska in an era when the expression of feeling was considered a private matter and the withholding of it a form of respect. He had been married to Johnny's mother, Ruth, for decades. He had raised 3 children. He had watched his youngest son become the most famous entertainer in America and had responded to this development with the specific combination of pride and bewilderment that parents feel when their children become something they hadn't anticipated. He had not watched The Tonight Show. This was not a statement. It was simply true. He didn't stay up late. He found the format somewhat overwhelming, and he felt, in the particular way of men who love their children but maintain careful distance from their public selves, that what his son did on television was for other people. Johnny was his son in the specific way that fathers and sons have specific relationships, separate from what either of them did for the rest of the world, operating in its own register, with its own history and its own rules. What Homer knew of his son's public career came primarily from Ruth, who watched the show regularly and reported on it in the way she reported on everything, thoroughly, with affection, with the particular editorial lens of a mother who is proud and wants her husband to be proud as well without pushing him toward it. Homer listened to these reports and responded to them in the way he responded to most things, with measured appreciation and very little elaboration. He was proud of Johnny. This was not in doubt. It simply did not require, in Homer Carson's accounting, a great deal of expression. On the evening of March 11th, 1974, Ruth Carson was visiting her sister in Omaha. Homer was alone in the Scottsdale house. It was a Monday night, and he had finished dinner and was reading in the living room when he reached the end of his book and found that he didn't want to start another one. He turned on the television. The Tonight Show was on. Homer Carson watched his son for the first time in 14 years of his son's career. He did not change the channel. He did not turn off the television after a few minutes because the format made him uncomfortable. He watched, in the quiet of an empty house in Scottsdale on a March evening, with the specific attention of a man who has been handed something he wasn't expecting and has decided it deserves his full consideration. What was happening on screen when Homer turned on the television was not the monologue and not an interview, but one of the less structured moments that occasionally emerged in the middle of a Tonight Show taping. A conversation between Carson and a guest that had strayed from its prepared territory into something more open. The guest that evening was a journalist who had been writing about the relationship between public performance and private life, and the conversation had been moving through several examples before it arrived, in the natural way of conversations that are going somewhere real at the subject of fathers. The journalist had asked, in the general terms of someone pursuing a theme rather than a specific biography, whether Carson thought the people who watched him felt they knew him. Carson had said that he thought they knew a version of him, the version that was useful for television, the version that had been refined across 14 years of nightly performance into something smooth and reliable and effective. He had said this without self-consciousness, the way he discussed the craft of what he did when a conversation gave him room to be specific about it. The journalist had asked whether the version they knew was very different from the version his family knew. Carson had been quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My father has never seen this show, not once in 14 years, and I think if I'm honest with myself, part of me is grateful for that, because the version of me he knows, the one he raised, is more real than the one that 14 million people think they know every night, and I'd rather he kept that one." He said it directly, without preamble, in the tone he used when he was saying something true rather than something performed. The audience responded with the specific quiet that audiences produce when they have heard something personal enough to require a moment of adjustment. Then he said, "I've never told him that. He probably doesn't know that's how I think about it." The journalist asked if he should tell him. Carson smiled, the real one, the one that Margaret Kowalski had been watching for from her hospital room in Cincinnati, and said, "Probably, but that's not how we do things." 14 million people heard this exchange. One of them was Homer Carson, sitting alone in a house in Scottsdale, Arizona, watching The Tonight Show for the first time in 14 years. Homer did not call that night. He finished watching the show, turned off the television, and went to bed. He was a deliberate man, not slow, but careful about the gap between impulse and action, having learned over 71 years that the things worth doing were usually worth a night's consideration first. He called the next morning at 9:15. Carson was in his office at NBC Burbank. His assistant Diane Kaplan took the call and came to his office door with an expression that told him something was unusual. She said, "Your father's on the line." Carson had spoken to his father perhaps a dozen times in the previous year. The standard calls of adult children and aging parents, logistical and warm in the specific limited way of people who love each other and are not practiced at saying so. His father had never called him at the office. Carson picked up the phone. Homer Carson said, "I watched your show last night." Carson said, "I know." He didn't know. He had no way of knowing, but the call told him, and his response was instinctive, the specific instinct of a son who understands, in the moment of hearing his father's voice in an unexpected context, exactly what has happened. Homer was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You should have told me that." Carson said, "I know." Homer said, "I'm telling you now that I know it." That was the exchange. 3 sentences from his father, 2 responses from his son. The call lasted approximately 3 minutes in total, most of which was the specific silence of 2 men sitting with something that had been said and received, and didn't require further elaboration. When Carson hung up, Diane Kaplan was in the corridor. She said later that he came out of his office and told her he wouldn't be available for the morning production meeting and asked her to reschedule it. He went back into his office and closed the door. He was in there for 2 hours. Nobody on the production staff went to his door. Nobody called through it. The building understood by then how to be quiet around something that required quietness. What he was doing in those 2 hours was not known. He left no record of it. His assistant said the office was silent. No telephone calls made or received, no sound of papers being moved or drawers being opened. Just silence for 2 hours in the office of a man who had spent 14 years filling silence with something that 14 million people found worth watching. The production meeting was rescheduled for the afternoon. Carson attended it and was, by every account of the people present, exactly as he always was. Precise, engaged, focused on the work ahead. He asked specific questions about the guest lineup, made 2 changes to the running order that he explained with the economy of someone who had been thinking about them for a while, and left the meeting at the same time he always left meetings. The morning's absence was noted and not discussed. The Tonight Show staff had been with Carson long enough to understand when something private had happened and when the right response to private things was to continue working. Ed McMahon, who had known Carson longer than almost anyone in the building, said years later that he had noticed something different about Carson in the tapings that followed March 11th. Not dramatically different, not in any way that the audience would have seen or that critics would have identified. Something subtler. A quality in the sign-off, he said, as though Carson was talking to someone specific rather than to a general audience, and had become, if anything, more comfortable with that than he had been before. McMahon said he hadn't known why at the time. He said he had assumed it was one of the periodic shifts that Carson made in his performance, the small refinements of a man who had been doing the same job for a very long time and understood it better each year. He said it was only later, when he heard the story of the March 11th call, that he understood what the shift had been. Carson had told 14 million people something he hadn't told his father. His father had heard it, and his father had called the next morning, not to congratulate him, not to express admiration for the show, not to say anything that required a particular kind of response, but simply to say, "I heard, I understand, I know." That was the shift McMahon had noticed, not a change in technique or phrasing or timing, a change in the quality of who Carson was talking to when he looked at the camera. He had been talking to an audience. After March 11, 1974, he was talking to a person. What Homer Carson meant by those words, I'm telling you now that I know it, was never elaborated on. Carson never discussed the call in any interview. McMahon's account was the closest anyone came to a public description of its effect. Homer Carson died in 1983, 9 years after that Monday night in Scottsdale, and whatever he had meant by those words existed now only in the space between what was said and what was understood, the space that fathers and sons sometimes inhabit for a lifetime without either of them finding the right language for it, and then one of them finds 3 minutes and 9 words. And that turns out to be enough. Because what Homer meant, in the specific language of a Nebraska man of his generation who had been raised in a time when the most important things were stated simply if they were stated at all, was, I heard what you said about me. I understand that you meant it. I want you to know that I received it, and I love you in the way that I have always loved you, which is the way that doesn't change regardless of what either of us does or doesn't say. That was all 9 words contained, everything a father and son needed to transfer between them, compressed into the duration of a Tuesday morning phone call that left one of them alone in his office for 2 hours afterward. I'm telling you now that I know it. 9 words. Said once. Received completely. Carried for the rest of a career that ended in May 1992, a career that had begun with a man who kept things private and had learned, on a March night in 1974, that the things we say sideways to 14 million people sometimes reach the one person we should have been saying them to directly. That was the whole of it. That was enough. But something happened in the years between 1974 and 1983, something that the people around Carson noticed without understanding and that Carson himself never explained. He called his father more often, not dramatically more. Not in the way of a man making up for lost time in a rush of guilt or sentiment. Quietly more, once a month rather than once every 6 weeks, sometimes for no logistical reason, just to talk in the limited way they talked about the weather in Scottsdale and the weather in Burbank and how Ruth was doing and whether the new car was working out. Small calls, deliberate, careful, in the register they had always used, but more of them. And different in a quality that Homer noticed and that Carson noticed Homer noticing, and that neither of them mentioned, because mentioning it would have required a kind of conversation that was outside the vocabulary they had built for each other across 40 years. Homer didn't come to Los Angeles to see the show. Carson didn't suggest it, and Homer didn't ask. The distance between who Homer was at home and who Johnny was on television remained what it had always been. Not a wound, not a failure of love, just a fact about the particular relationship they had, which had its own shape and didn't need to be reshaped into something else to mean something. Homer Carson died on April 6, 1983, in Scottsdale. He was 80 years old. Carson was in the middle of a production week and flew to Arizona the following morning. He was back in Burbank 4 days later. The Tonight Show staff said that Carson was unchanged when he returned, in the way that made them understand he had already done what he needed to do in Arizona and had come back because coming back was the next thing. He taped the show that night with the same precision and the same attention and the same quality of presence that had defined 14,000 nights of television. At the end of that taping, he paused before the credits. He looked at the camera. He said goodnight to someone who knows who they are. It might have been Margaret in Cincinnati. It might have been Homer in a Scottsdale that no longer had Homer in it. It might have been both of them, or neither, or anyone, watching who had something they hadn't said yet to someone who deserved to hear it. That was the whole of it. That was enough. If this story reminded you of something you haven't said to someone who deserves to hear it, share it with someone today. Subscribe for more untold stories about the legends behind the television, and leave a comment about something you've been meaning to say to someone that you haven't said yet. Homer had never needed Johnny to be anything other than what he was. Not the entertainer, not the star, not the most watched man in America. Just the boy from Norfolk, Nebraska, who had done magic tricks at the Elks Club and grown into something nobody had fully predicted. That was the version Homer had. That was the version he kept. And on a Tuesday morning in March, in a 3-minute phone call that cost him nothing except the courage to make it, he made sure his son knew that he had it, that it was safe, that it wasn't going anywhere, and that 14 million people knowing the other version didn't diminish the one that Homer had been holding since before any of the rest of it existed.